There, I am glad you can make it today. We are in the book of Joshua, chapters 3 through 6. Now, last time I told you briefly about the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, which led them into the promised land. And I wanted to touch on that a little bit more because this was really a big deal in that the people had to prepare themselves to move over the river itself. And in doing so, since they didn't know where they were going, they had to follow instructions pretty closely. And that's one of the things about how it was then with God and still is to this day, that we need to kind of pay attention to how we are instructed to behave and listening to what we're supposed to do, because for one thing, it's what God wants, and for another, it keeps us out of a lot of trouble. So the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant went into the river first, and the people who'd been prepared said, "Okay, you follow them, but you're not close to it. You're a good distance away." But because of the way the river stopped flowing, plenty of ground dried up so that they could move across. Okay, they got across. They're in the promised land. The manna that God had been giving them to eat stopped because they were now in the promised land and had food that they could find there to eat. And so they no longer needed what God had provided in that sense. Well, there is still the issue of dealing with Jericho. And there is a plan that comes up. And here is the cool way, at least to me, it's pretty cool how it happens. So it's nighttime, and Joshua is outside, and we don't know exactly what he's doing, but suddenly he sees a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword. Okay, that could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, because he doesn't know who this is. And Joshua asked a question that's pretty simple and to the point. He said, "Are you on our side, or are you on our enemy's side?" The answer is neither. Okay, that's one of those things that makes you pay attention to it, because you think, wait, who is this guy? He's got a drawn sword. So that's a little bit dangerous right there. Because he has it drawn, it's like he's prepared to use it. And the person there is Joshua. Um, there was a story going back to the Civil War where you had two sides that had a lot of people who believed in God who were fighting against each other, and each side was thinking that God was on their side. And the president at that time was Abraham Lincoln, and someone asked him what he thought about that. And he said, I'm not too interested in knowing if God is on our side or their side. I'm more interested in being on God's side. And you see, there he had the right idea. Well, we come back to Joshua, and he finds out this person with a sword is not on either side, but he identifies himself. He says, "I am the commander of the Lord's army." Well, Joshua immediately bows down and says, "What message does God have for his servant?" Meaning himself. Because you got to think, okay, angels are tough. Okay, an angel in God's army would be even tougher. The commander of God's army would be the toughest there is. So this is a very dangerous individual. And he looks like a human. He's not human. So Joshua does the right thing. Joshua's a tough guy. He's not going to back off from a necessary fight, but he realizes, okay, this is from God. I need to find out what to do. And you don't hear anything about the conversation after this, except the angel tells him something interesting. Take off your shoes. Well, it really says take off your sandals, but you get the idea. You start thinking, wait a second, where have I heard this before? Oh, that's right. When Moses saw the burning bush and approached it, God spoke out of the burning bush and said, take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. So we're thinking, this is extraordinary. This is a direct message from God. And as a result, those shoes come off. All right. The next thing we find out in the story is some interesting instructions. And Jericho, which is the target, is all locked up. Normally, you'd have the gates open during the day and then close them at night for safety. Well, they've got the gates closed all of the time. They know the Israelites are there and the Israelites are coming. And sure enough, they see the Israelite army coming. And it looks kind of odd because you have some soldiers and then you have some priests blowing on horns. But these are not normal horns. These are the horns from a ram, which, as you may know, is an animal, a boy lamb, if you want to call it that. And they have the horns on the side of their head that curl around. Well, the Israelites and maybe other people had learned that if you heat these up, you can straighten them out and then you can blow through them a certain way and make a loud noise. Well, they had 7 priests who had these horns and they were blowing them. Okay, so you've got some soldiers, you've got the priest with the horns, and then you've got more soldiers. And the soldiers have been instructed no war cries, no yelling. They may have been able to talk a little bit, but you certainly weren't supposed to shout out or anything. So they start walking. They don't attack the city, but they walk all of the way around it and then go back to camp. Now, that would have looked weird to the people of Jericho because they don't know what's going on. It's like, I haven't seen anything like this before. Next day, same thing happens. They come out, they're blowing the horns, the army goes around it, and it would have been especially creepy because there are no yells. Very common in that day to yell out threats and to sound wild and to do what they could with their voices to scare their opponents. The Israelites were not doing any of this. Third day, the same thing. So this has got to be terrifying. The people of Jericho are wondering what's going to happen. When's it going to happen? Fourth day, same thing. Fifth day, same thing. Sixth day, the same thing. Well, at this point, the people of Jericho might be thinking, oh, well, they're just going to walk around us all this time. That's it. They can't get in, and we can wait them out. Seventh day, the army shows up again. They walk around the city. Now remember, this is under Joshua's instructions, and this is what I think the commander of the Lord's army was telling them to do during that time where we think we didn't know what was said. It had to be this. So the Israelites, on the seventh day, they walk around. Now they circle the city a second time. Suddenly, the people in Jericho are nervous again. A third time, a fourth time, a fifth time, sixth time. And so in Jericho, they know something's going to happen. And they're right. The seventh time around. They then, of course, blowing the horns, and now the people shout. With a loud shout, they're making all kinds of racket, and the walls of Jericho collapse. Now, you may remember there were 2 sets of walls going around Jericho. Well, they're both down, and the army of Israelites rushes in. Now, they had been given very specific instructions. Everything in this city belonged to God. He said, the gold, the silver, the iron, the bronze, all that is God's. So that goes into the treasury for the worship of God. Everything else, all of the people are to be killed. Everything in the city is to be burned. And that's exactly what happens. They go in, all of the people are wiped out, and then everything's burned. So you have to think, wait, there would have been a lot of valuable things in the city. Didn't matter, it's to be burned. Because this is the offering to God. This is giving to God first before you take anything for yourself. This is the trust in God that He will provide for you because you are essentially destroying all of these things that you could use. So, very important that the people would follow this. Now, you may remember there was one person they said, okay, we won't kill you. And that was Rahab and her family. Well, true to their word, she was spared, her family was spared. So everybody else in the city dies. Rahab and her family stayed inside her home until they were allowed to come out. And they were not Israelites at this point, but they were allowed to go and camp outside of the Israelite camp. And eventually they make their way into the line of Israel. So they were accepted in. Reason being, well, they knew about God and they followed God. So the people who follow God are accepted by God. And you notice they didn't always have to be Israelites, but they did have to follow God. They did have to trust in Him and do for Him what they could. All right, eventually we're going to find out that in the lineage of Jesus. And when I say lineage, we're talking about, okay, you have your parents, and then your grandparents, and your great grandparents, and so forth and so on, all the way back. Eventually, we find that Rahab is one of the people who leads to Jesus. So he's like a, or she was like a great, 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 great grandmother to Jesus. And that's pretty cool because you go, where she had been before she met God was a terrible place. But she ends up being honored because she chooses to follow God. Okay, with that, we have had the first major victory inside the promised land, and things will continue from there. But that is a story for another day. For today, I want to show you my tie. You notice all of these bricks in my tie. That represents the wall of Jericho before it fell. And with the characters I have on my tie, if you count them, there are 7 of them to remind us of the 7 priests blowing the horns as they circled the city of Jericho. All right, with that, I will let you go and hope to see you next time. Bye.